Before he became a national hero, before his face appeared in textbooks and monuments, he was just a fragile little boy called Pepe, a boy too small to command attention, too sickly to inspire fear, too quiet to seem dangerous. And yet, centuries later, an empire still remembers his name. This is not merely the story of José Rizal. This is the story of how a frail Filipino child transformed himself into a global intellectual and used knowledge, history, and truth as weapons against colonial rule. On June 19, 1861, in the town of Calamba, Laguna, Jose Protasio Rizal Mercado y Alonso Realonda was born into a large and educated family. He was the seventh of the 11 children. But unlike the image history would later immortalize, young Pepe or Jose Rizal was frail, undersized, and often sick. His siblings teased him for his tiny body and unusually large head. No one could have imagined that this quiet child would one day terrify an empire. Because he could not rely on physical strength, Pepe cultivated something far more powerful: his mind. While other children played outside, Rizal buried himself in books. He learned poetry, painting, sculpture, and languages at an astonishing age. His weakness forced him to become an observer, and observers often see what others refuse to notice. Then came the first wounds that changed his life forever. His mother, Teodora Alonso, was falsely accused of a crime and forced to walk miles to prison. For the young Rizal, colonial injustice was no longer an abstract idea. It had entered his home. Only months later, another tragedy shook the colony. Following the Cavite Mutiny, 3 Filipino priests were publicly executed: Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora. Together, they became known as Gumborza. Their deaths awakened something inside the young Rizal, a realization that intelligence alone could not protect Filipinos from oppression. Rizal excelled at the Ateneo Municipal de Manila, graduating with highest honors. But when he entered the University of Santo Tomas, reality struck harder. Despite his brilliance, native students were treated as inferior to Spaniards. No matter how intelligent a Filipino became, the colonial system would never truly see him as equal. When his mother's eyesight began failing, Rizal chose to study medicine, not for prestige, but for love. He dreamt of restoring her vision. Little did he know, he would soon begin opening the eyes of an entire nation. In 1882, Rizal secretly left the Philippines. Funded by his older brother, Bastiano Rizal, he sailed toward Europe carrying little more than ambition, intellect, and an impossible dream: to prove that Filipinos were equals in a world determined to see them as lesser beings. In Spain, Rizal earned degrees in medicine and philosophy, but education was only part of his transformation. Europe exposed him to liberal ideas, scientific thinking, and political freedom. For the first time, he saw societies where questioning authority was possible, and he began asking dangerous questions about the empire. Rizal traveled across Europe, training under elite ophthalmologists in Paris and Germany. He formed friendships with scholars like Ferdinand Blumentritt and joined prestigious scientific organizations led by figures such as Rudolf Virchow. At a time when colonial powers claimed Asians were intellectually inferior, Rizal stood among Europe's finest minds as an equal. His existence alone challenged imperial ideology, but knowledge came at a cost. In Berlin, Rizal struggled with poverty and hunger while finishing the book that would change his life forever, Noli Me Tangere. The novel exposed friar abuse, corruption, racism, and the cruelty of colonial rule. It was not simply literature, it was resistance. The empire immediately recognized the danger, not because Rizal carried weapons, but because he carried the truth. And truth spreads faster than fear. When Rizal returned home in 1887, he successfully restored his mother's eyesight. But while his mother regained vision, the Spanish authorities began watching his every move. The Noli had transformed him into a marked man. Threats surrounded his family. Soon, Rizal was forced into exile once again. His second journey across the world changed him even more deeply. In Japan, he experienced dignity and discipline. In America, he admired industrial progress but witnessed brutal racial discrimination. And in London, he began one of his most revolutionary projects. Inside the British Museum, Rizal studied Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. Spain claimed Filipinos were uncivilized before colonization. Rizal fought back using history itself. Through meticulous annotations, he proved that pre-colonial Filipinos possessed thriving societies, trade systems, and culture long before Spanish rule. This was more than research. It was intellectual decolonization. By 1891, Rizal's optimism had begun fading. His second novel, El Filibusterismo, was darker and more explosive. If Noli exposed society's sickness, El Feli asked what happens when peaceful reform fails. Rizal was no longer simply criticizing the empire, he was warning it. In 1892, Rizal returned to the Philippines knowing full well it could cost him his life. He founded La Liga Filipina, a peaceful movement promoting education, agriculture, and unity. But the colonial government saw danger in organized Filipinos. Days later, Rizal was arrested and exiled to Dapitan. Exile did not silence Rizal. In Dapitan, he transformed an isolated town through education, science, medicine, and community service. He built schools and water systems. He discovered new species and sent scientific specimens to museums across Europe. Even in exile, his mind continued reaching the world. In 1896, the Katipunan launched a revolution against Spain under the leadership of Andres Bonifacio. Ironically, they marched under Rizal's name. Despite Rizal warning that the nation was not yet ready for armed revolt, but ideas can no longer be controlled once they awaken a people. Rizal was arrested, returned to Manila in chains, and accused of inspiring rebellion. His trial was little more than a performance designed to justify execution. On the night before his death, Rizal wrote one final poem, Mi Ultimo Adios. He hid it inside an alcohol stove and secretly handed it to his sister Trinidad Rizal, whispering, "There is something inside." December 30, 1896, 7:03 in the morning, at Bagumbayan, José Rizal faced a firing squad composed of native soldiers under Spanish command. The empire feared him so deeply they executed a writer as though he were an army. As bullets struck his body, Rizal twisted himself to face the morning sun, a final act of defiance. The frail child once mocked for his weakness had become immortal. José Rizal never lived to see Philippine independence, but his idea survived longer than the empire that tried to silence him. Today, his legacy remains more than history. In an age of misinformation, oppression, and historical distortion, Rizal reminds us that education without courage is meaningless, that truth demands sacrifice, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon against tyranny is a mind that refuses to surrender.